Welcome to Victorian addiction, when morphine and heroin were miracle cures and addiction was just a charming side effect. Doctors called it medicine, patients called it marvellous, and absolutely no one called it what it was. At least not until the séance started. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories where medicinal miracles came with a side of dependency, hit that like button and subscribe for more delightfully drowsy disasters. This episode is part of our Victorian series, a charming collection of bedtime stories exploring the most bizarre and beautiful sides of 19th century life. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, because there's something oddly soothing about knowing we're all nodding off to tales of syringes, scandals, and socially acceptable sedation. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and let yourself drift off into a world where being calm, content, and chemically blissed out was just good manners. You're inconsolable, you're devastated, you're absolutely ruined by grief, although to be fair, you've also been mildly inconvenienced. Your cousin Beatrice dropped dead at tea yesterday, or maybe it was your cat, or maybe someone bumped into you slightly harder than expected and you haven't emotionally recovered. It's hard to tell. But this is Victorian London, and you are overcome. The diagnosis: nervous collapse, the prescription, morphine and a quiet scream into the void. You're draped across a fainting couch like a dying opera singer, clutching a monogrammed handkerchief soaked in both tears and what might be brandy. A doctor has been summoned. He enters the room without knocking, wearing a hat 3 sizes too small and a cloak that smells like antique despair. He takes one look at you and shouts, "Hysteria!" You attempt to speak, but only produce a sound like a haunted accordion. The doctor claps with delight. "Textbook case," he yells. "Severe nerves, possibly spiritual in origin, or uterine. We don't know." You're asked to lie still while Nurse Fenwick wraps your head in a velvet poultice and whispers something about ghosts in the spleen. Meanwhile, the doctor retrieves a bottle labelled "For women, widows and other hysterical creatures." The ingredients list includes morphine, rosewater, cocaine, and a tincture of crushed hope. "This will restore your feminine balance," he says, uncorking it with his teeth. "And possibly your vision, and possibly your soul." You're given 1 tablespoon and immediately forget who Beatrice was. You're given a 2nd tablespoon and forget who you are. You're given a 3rd tablespoon and forget how linear time works. Now you are floating, possibly sideways, and you can hear the carpet breathing. The doctor declares you comfortably dulled. Nurse Fenwick weeps quietly into a plant. You don't know why, but it's beautiful. "Rest," the doctor says softly. "Do not attempt to feel anything for at least a fortnight. If symptoms of joy or emotion return, take another dose and lie back down." You do, and you are fine. And Beatrice, whoever she was, will not be missed. By the mid to late 19th century, Victorian society had fully embraced the idea that sadness, grief, emotional unrest, and even mild boredom could be treated pharmacologically. And morphine was the velvet hammer of choice. It was the age of the nervous condition. Doctors tossed the term around with abandon. Women were nervous. Children were nervous. Men who cried were nervous, unless they had money, in which case they were philosophically inclined. Medical journals described nervousness as a result of overstimulation, weakened moral character, exposure to poetry, or prolonged exposure to furniture with sharply carved accents. And grief? That was just another form of nervous collapse, especially in women. In an 1882 column from the Illustrated London News, a physician remarked, "It is best to quell the pain of the female mind before it spreads to the organs." Morphine, taken by dropper or spoon, was used to numb grief, blunt sorrow, erase anxiety, and help mourners settle themselves emotionally for public appearance. One advertisement in the Times, 1879, promoted Dr. Haskell's gentle restoration for the relief of widows, spinsters, and all afflicted by nervous turns of mood. It contained morphine, chloroform, brandy, and violet flavouring. 1 teaspoon could induce sleep. 2 could stop a funeral. These tonics were especially popular after bereavement. While Queen Victoria famously mourned Prince Albert for decades, most grieving widows were expected to compose themselves within a respectable period, and morphine helped ensure they could do so without embarrassing anyone by crying too audibly. In more extreme cases, family physicians prescribed morphine injections to quiet the system. A case study from the British Medical Journal, 1887, reported a widow who threw herself across the piano in inconsolable grief, but calmed after application of morphia and a soft linen dressing. This wasn't just a women's issue either. Soldiers returning from war were also prescribed morphine for melancholia. One veteran of the Crimean War wrote in a letter to the Pall Mall Gazette, "The draft made me dream of fields. I remembered less. I wept less. I no longer feared the mirror." By the 1890s, addiction was quietly rampant, but in polite society it was referred to as being dependent on one's tonic, or suffering from a condition of chronic tranquillity, because nothing in Victorian society was more fashionable than appearing completely unaffected. And if someone noticed your trembling hands or vacant stare, well, that was just nerves again. Thankfully there was more morphine for that, and speaking of things no one liked to talk about, there was one group whose nerves were treated with particular urgency. New mothers. You're about to be one, and the doctor has something even stronger in store, or don't worry, you won't remember a thing. You've just given birth, you think. You're not entirely sure, because you're currently lying in a bed surrounded by strangers, sweating profusely, holding a turnip someone handed you for comfort, and you can't remember the last 14 hours, or your last name. A woman in a crisp cap tells you the baby is healthy, although you're unclear on which direction the baby went or if you've actually met it yet. There's a small bucket on your chest labelled for weeping, and next to you sits the doctor, smoking something deeply illegal by modern standards, and scribbling into a leather notebook titled Diagnosis Motherhood. "You'll be a bit tired," he says, "but we've handled the real trouble." You blink slowly. "What trouble?" you ask, voice hoarse. "Oh, the part where you screamed like a wounded goose and begged for divine mercy," he replies casually. "But don't worry. We gave you morphine halfway through the delivery and again just before the afterbirth. Is that why I can't feel my spleen?" He pats your arm. "Or your soul?" "Yes, that's normal." You attempt to sit up but realise your legs are missing, or possibly still attached but currently unaware of their responsibilities. A nurse places a tray of biscuits next to you and says, "Eat one, if you remember how." The doctor continues, "You may experience some emotions, so I've also given you a mild dose for grief, mood swings, and the occasional moment of reflection. You're a mother now. That sort of thing's frowned upon. You want to ask what your baby looks like, but the words come out as a soft hum in the key of B minor. Someone brushes your hair. Someone else feeds you a spoonful of warm milk laced with morphine and encouragement. You lie back, peaceful, comfortably detached, emotionally unavailable. Congratulations. You're officially Victorian postpartum. Victorian childbirth was less a medical event and more a battlefield with lace trim. And once the baby arrived, the goal wasn't necessarily to celebrate. It was to sedate. Morphine use in postpartum care was widespread across Britain by the mid to late 1800s. Mothers were expected to compose themselves quickly, resume household roles, and avoid expressing too much physical or emotional distress, which, given that they'd just pushed out a human being with 1850s plumbing and no epidural, was a bit of an ask. Enter laudanum and morphine, the quieting miracle workers. One 1875 issue of The Lancet recommended morphine in measured drops to soothe the maternal nerves and encourage agreeable detachment from corporeal discomfort. Translated, "Shut her up, she's scaring the servants." A common tonic known as Mother's Quiet Companion advertised itself in the Illustrated Family Doctor as a blessing for the worn-out mother, containing morphine, peppermint oil, and enough alcohol to pickle an entire school choir. It promised cheerful spirits, cessation of complaint, and uninterrupted rest. Women were given morphine for pain from uterine cramping and tearing. Postnatal depression, diagnosed as excessive sentiment, Sleep difficulties, especially those caused by infants daring to cry, emotional overactivity, including sighing and long-staring episodes. In more upscale clinics, women were even offered morphine injections before or after visits from their husbands to ensure tranquil marital re-entry. One recorded case from the 1890 British Medical Journal describes a woman who was elevated to a state of charming vacancy after receiving a 4 mg morphine injection postpartum. Her child was placed in her arms, to which she reportedly responded, "I shall name it lunch." Morphine didn't just dull pain, it erased reality in a way that Victorian society found convenient. A mourning widow, a grieving mother, or a sleepless wife could all be cured the same way, one dropper at a time until they no longer had any complaints or coherent thoughts. But there were consequences. Many women quietly developed lifelong dependencies, often diagnosed later as general female weakness, or a fondness for her restorative. Babies were sometimes breastfed while their mothers were dosed, resulting in drowsy infants described by midwives as exceedingly well behaved. And if a mother became too emotional, well, there were stronger options available. Which brings us to the next miracle of Victorian medicine, the one that promised relief from nerve pain, headaches, overstimulation, and inconvenient feelings. The one with gold lettering on the bottle and danger in every drop. You wake up with your head in a soup bowl, a fork in your pocket, and the haunting suspicion that someone has replaced your brain with static. A man is sawing wood inside your skull. A child is singing a single note on repeat. The floor is too loud. It's your nerves, of course, or maybe your brain. Whatever it is, the doctor says he has just the thing, and soon you will remember nothing at all. You wake up mid-migraine and immediately declare war on the ceiling. Your skull feels like it's trying to fold inward. The gas lamp is flickering too loudly. Someone is whispering, but it's your spine. You attempt to groan, but instead let out a Latin chant no one taught you. The maid finds you curled under the piano holding a fork and crying. "Another neuralgia," she mutters, tossing a doily over your head like a birdcage cover. "Don't worry, the doctor's bringing the brain syrup." Enter the doctor, smelling of menthol and quiet panic. He glances at your face and announces, "The pain is behind the left eye. That's the drama eye." Without waiting for consent, he unrolls a leather pouch of syringes and selects the one labelled for decadent thinking. "This will calm the nerves," he explains, "and silence any dangerous philosophical tendencies. You're injected before you can protest. 10 seconds later, your jaw forgets gravity and your thoughts turn into soup. Someone hands you a cup of tea. You thank the carpet. "Perfect," says the doctor. "We'll keep dosing until you forget what books are." And just like that, your migraine is gone, along with your ability to do math, recall your name, or stand. In Victorian Britain, migraines and neuralgia were treated with all the tenderness and scientific insight of a cannonball to the face. Both conditions, loosely defined as any pain you can't point to with certainty, were considered fashionable afflictions of the refined and overscheduled. Migraines were seen as nervous disorders of the intellectual class, while neuralgia, searing, often unexplained nerve pain, was described in one 1883 issue of The Practitioner as the wailing of the body in protest against civilization. And morphine? It was the perfect silencer. Physicians praised it for its ability to render the patient docile, restful, and comfortably forgetful of the head. In fact, morphine was so effective that it was routinely prescribed for toothaches that became too philosophical, electric nerves caused by the telegraph, face pain, without cause but full of attitude, and a phenomenon called railway spine, which was essentially "ow, I rode the train too hard." One advertisement from 1887 promised that Dr. Bellington's neuralgia restorative would quell cranial thunder and restore equilibrium to the feminine soul. It contained morphine, chloroform, peppermint oil, and possibly a mild curse. In a published letter to The Lancet, 1892, one gentleman wrote, For 40 years I have suffered such head pains as to drive me to despair. Now, with a regular dose of morphine, I suffer no longer. I have also stopped fearing doorknobs. Of course, there were downsides. Dosages were often guessed, pain returned quickly, and patients developed dependencies that were hand-waved as habitual placidity. But the medical consensus remained. Morphine was better than pain. And in a society where emotional expression was already discouraged, dulling the nerves made you a better citizen. Until, of course, those nerves began to rot from the inside. But speaking of rot, there's one condition that truly terrified Victorians. It crept into homes, stained handkerchiefs, and made everyone cough with unsettling flair. And for that, the doctors reached for the good stuff. You're coughing again. Loud, dramatic, phlegm-adjacent coughing. The kind that demands an audience and a chaise lounge. You reach for a handkerchief and discover you've already used it to ruin 3 novels and a teacup. The doctor clears his throat from across the room as if competing with your lungs. He's been here 6 minutes and already looks emotionally exhausted. Classic consumption, he declares without making eye contact. The lungs are sighing, possibly offended, possibly romantic. He pours something thick and suspicious into a spoon from a bottle labelled Doctor. Penworthy's chest relief, for coughing, grief, and unladylike wheezing. What's in it, you ask, mid-wheeze? Morphine, he says, and a dash of quiet. You swallow it. The coughing stops. So does everything else. Blinking, thinking, worrying about the blood on your pillow. Lovely, the doctor says. We'll just keep you pleasantly detached until your body decides what it's doing. You nod slowly, and forget what your lungs were so upset about in the first place. In Victorian England, tuberculosis was more than a disease. It was practically a lifestyle. Known as consumption, it slowly withered the body in a way the Victorians found oddly poetic. Pale skin, delicate features, melancholy expressions. If you were going to die horribly, at least you'd look ethereal doing it. Of course, tuberculosis was highly contagious, but that didn't stop society from romanticising it. Many young women were praised for having that lovely consumptive glow. Men composed tragic sonnets. Artists painted deathbeds. The upper classes wheezed fashionably through salons. Treatment options were limited. Doctors recommended cold air, warm air, fresh air, sea air, Switzerland. And if all else failed, morphine. Morphine didn't cure tuberculosis, but it made patients stop complaining. It soothed the constant coughing, dulled the rib-cracking pain, and helped patients sleep through the final acts of their tragic opera. One 1891 ad in the Morning Chronicle promoted Dr. Sylvan's chest elixir, promising relief for consumptives, melancholics, and those plagued by inconvenient lungs. It contained morphine, opium, sugar syrup, and optimism. In the British Medical Journal, a physician wrote, "The patient's distress is reduced, their coughing softened. Though the lungs remain corrupted, the spirit grows docile." It was also common to inject morphine directly when patients began to lose consciousness, not to save them, but to make the dying more comfortable and, if possible, quieter. Hospitals stocked morphine like tea. Wealthy households kept it in crystal decanters labelled sleep cordial. It was offered at sanatoriums alongside beef tea, open windows, and false hope. And for patients too poor to afford proper treatment, there were cheaper tonics. Small glass bottles from street chemists labelled soothing syrups, sold for pennies, and sipped until the cough stopped. Or the breathing did. But perhaps the most tragic irony was this. Tuberculosis was the one illness where visible decline was socially accepted. You could be pale, sickly, sensitive, and bedbound, and no one would accuse you of laziness. In fact, they might write you a poem. And if you finally slipped away, the obituary would mention how peacefully she passed, free from pain and most becomingly dressed. Thanks, morphine. But grief wasn't exclusive to widows and weepy aunts. No, the Victorian era made plenty of room for emotional instability among the other half of the population, especially those who refused to admit they had any. Because sometimes the one suffering from nerves wasn't the lady fainting into a monogrammed handkerchief. It was the gentleman shouting at the butler because someone moved his shaving brush. You're not well. You're a Victorian husband, which means your job is to overreact to drafts, sigh heavily during breakfast, and occasionally have an emotional breakdown if someone moves the newspaper. Lately you've been difficult. You insist it's constitutional strain. Your wife insists it's you. She's called the doctor. You protest, firmly, with the conviction of a man who's read half a medical journal once. You claim to be simply overburdened with civic thoughts. You explain that shouting at the butler was therapeutic. You sit down, you stand up. You sit down again, sigh louder, and glare at the curtains as if they started this. The doctor arrives wearing a waistcoat made entirely of patience. He watches as you launch into a mild rant about how the hallway feels emotionally hostile, then calmly prescribes a calming cordial and asks your wife if you've been slamming the teacups again. You refuse the medicine. Your wife puts it in your tea. 3 sips later, you announce that the couch is your best friend and you've forgiven your father. Better, your wife says, gently stroking your forehead with a sardine fork. You sink into the cushions like a man who has just made peace with gravity. You are calm, you are agreeable, you are medically quiet. In Victorian England, emotional fragility wasn't just reserved for women. Men, too, suffered from nerves, hysteria, and sudden outbursts of personality. The difference? No one was allowed to admit it. Doctors, ever diplomatic, created helpful euphemisms for male distress. Neurasthenia, congestion of the temperament, and the always popular excessive excitability due to constitutional strain. These translated roughly to, your husband is insufferable, and no one knows what to do with him. The solution? Morphine. Originally intended to treat women suffering from female complaints, morphine found its way into marriages via discreet dosing, often encouraged by doctors and occasionally suggested by wives. A letter published anonymously in the Lady's Companion in 1889 reads, "My husband, of good standing but violent temper, has been considerably improved by Dr. Weatherby's restful drops, taken nightly in his brandy. He has stopped shouting at pigeons and no longer weeps at meat pies." Many tonics marketed as nerve restoratives contained morphine or opium, but were cleverly labelled as household remedies. They were advertised as appropriate for both the faint-hearted wife and the overwrought gentleman. One such remedy, Berkeley's Quiet Constitutionals, claimed to cool the blood, regulate the masculine spirit, and render conversation more civil. Another, Dr. Broomhall's harmonizing syrup, was said to cure shouting, stomping, and domestic rages related to trousers. Not all cases were covert. Some men sought treatment for real emotional breakdowns, often due to grief, overwork, or political disappointment. A physician writing in The Lancet in 1893 detailed a patient who had collapsed following a stern letter from the tax office and was treated with morphine, port wine, and 8 days of supervised napping. Morphine was favoured because it didn't require introspection, apologies, or talking to anyone. Ideal for Victorian men. It dulled rage, softened brooding, and made men briefly tolerable at dinner. Of course, it also created dependency. But by the time anyone noticed, most patients were too sedated to be angry about it. And wives, especially those married to ambitious, overbearing barristers with tightly wound moustaches, found that a quiet teaspoon before bed could do wonders for the tone of the household. After all, it was still a man's world. But sometimes that world needed a spoonful of morphine to shut up and sit down. But not all husbands were the problem. Sometimes it was the children. Tiny, loud, constantly awake children. And for that the Victorians had an even simpler solution. Your child has a cough, not a dramatic cough, not a fevered, gasping, melodramatic Victorian death cough. Just a little one, a polite occasional ahem. The doctor says not to worry. Perfectly normal, he assures you, while rummaging through a black bag full of bottles, syringes, and secrets. He hands you a vial labelled Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It'll help him sleep, he says, and possibly forget he has lungs. You give the child a spoonful, he falls asleep immediately, so does the dog. The room becomes quieter than the grave, but somehow cozier. You check the label again. Ah, heroin. Lovely. In the late Victorian era, children didn't need to be very sick to be medicated. They simply needed to be inconvenient. Teething, coughing, crying at an inopportune moment. There was a syrup for that. Dozens of them, in fact. All marketed as soothing, calming, or suitable for infants, and often containing generous doses of heroin, morphine, or opium. One of the most infamous was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which promised relief from colic, teething pain, diarrhea, and general fussiness. It also, according to a glowing 1885 ad in the Illustrated London News, promoted restful slumber, angelic temperament, and household harmony. What the ad didn't mention was the 65 milligrams of morphine per ounce, and that was just one product. There was also Godfrey's cordial, mostly opium, syrup, and a prayer, Kendal Black Drop, opium, vinegar, and a threat. Street vendor infant tonics, often unregulated, unlabelled, and lethal. These syrups were sold without prescription, recommended by doctors, and enthusiastically given to babies, toddlers, and anyone under 5 who dared to make noise after 8 p.m. A chilling 1890 report in the British Medical Journal noted, "The infant mortality rate among working-class households using cordials is alarmingly high. Many children expire not from illness but from misapplied calm." But the practice wasn't confined to the poor. Upper-class nurseries were just as fogged with morphine. Nannies were instructed to dose babies at night so the mother could entertain visitors without interruption. One duchess reportedly called laudanum the mother's second governess. By the time heroin entered the market in the 1890s, it was hailed as a non-addictive alternative to morphine, and so naturally began appearing in syrups marketed for children. The Bayer company, yes, that Bayer, proudly sold heroin trademark as a children's cough suppressant in cheerful yellow packaging. It worked. Children stopped coughing, children stopped crying. In some cases, children just stopped. By the early 20th century, medical journals began sounding the alarm, but the damage was already done. Generations had been raised in a haze of chemical quiet, and no one heard them complain. But don't worry. Not all children were sedated, some were simply told to behave, or else. And when fear failed, there was always mother's little helper. You don't feel quite right. Nothing dramatic. Just a fluttering in the chest, a tightness behind the eyes, and an overwhelming desire to scream into a drawer. The doctor says it's nerves. Your aunt says it's too much thinking. The butler says you tried to bite him again, so you go to the apothecary. You're not sure what you're looking for, but you know it comes in a glass bottle and has a label with a Latin word and a moustache on it. The chemist greets you with the solemn air of a man who's seen too much sneezing. You explain your symptoms, sorrow, sighing, a general sense that your soul is undercooked. He nods once and hands you a bottle of Dr. Grimstone's absolutely guaranteed internal peace. You ask what's in it. He winks. You uncork the bottle. It smells like licorice and oblivion. You take one sip and immediately forget who you were mad at, what day it is, and how stairs work. Your knees buckle slightly, but emotionally you feel incredible. The chemist gives you 2 more bottles, just in case you plan to interact with your relatives. You thank him by hugging the display of leeches on your way out. In Victorian England, you didn't need a prescription to get high, you just needed a mildly inconvenient emotion and a few coins. The shelves of local chemists and general stores were lined with tonics, syrups, bitters, elixirs, cordials, drops, and electric fluid remedies, all claiming to cure everything from fatigue to despair to a general reluctance to participate in life. And they sold very well. What was in these miracle bottles? Morphine, heroin, opium, chloroform, cocaine, alcohol, and occasionally gold, mercury, vinegar, and instructions written by lunatics. They went by respectable names like Dr. Bateman's pectoral drops, Fellow's compound syrup of hyperphosphates, Mother Bailey's quiet juice, Hamlin's wizard oil, Dr. Tibble's Vi Cocoa, containing actual cocoa and also cocaine. One of the most popular, chlorodyne, promised to cure coughs, diarrhea, depression, hysteria, and unrest of the soul. It was a best-selling elixir for decades, containing chloroform, morphine, and treacle. According to an 1894 ad, it was ideal for sea voyages, heartbreak, and minor social trauma. Another, Vin Mariani, was a coca wine, actual wine infused with cocaine. It was advertised in British medical journals as restorative, rejuvenating, and well-suited to clergymen, opera singers, and women of culture. Queen Victoria reportedly drank it. So did Pope Leo XIII. The labels rarely warned of side effects. There were no dosage regulations. Bottles often read, "Use liberally as needed. Refill weekly." And because these were over-the-counter remedies, they were treated with the same casual enthusiasm as peppermint drops. Children took them. Grandmothers kept them in their sewing boxes. Doctors carried them in waistcoat flasks. It wasn't uncommon for households to keep one tonic for coughs, one for anxiety, one for digestion, all of which were chemically indistinguishable and universally intoxicating. In a letter to the Medical Times in 1887, one London physician warned, "The modern household is a cabinet of chemical delusions. What we call a tonic is often a tranquilizer. What we call a remedy is, in fact, a sedative curtain." By the time warnings became widespread, millions had become dependent on these silent miracle bottles, and no one could remember what they felt like before they started taking them. If anything, you're sitting on the edge of your bed, wearing a corset, a smile, and the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's been offered another cup of tea instead of emotional support. The bottle on your nightstand is labelled Ladies' Relief Tonic for sadness, sleeplessness, and feeling slightly too much. You take a sip and forget why you were upset in the first place. You wake up with cramps, cold feet, and the vague memory of threatening a tea cozy during the night. You are officially unwell, not dying of typhoid unwell, which earns sympathy, or fainting dramatically in church unwell, which earns applause, but the other kind. The kind that happens once a month, ruins your morning, and is immediately dismissed as a touch of nerves. You mention the pain to your maid. She gasps, closes the curtains and whispers, "Don't worry, miss, the doctor's coming. He knows all about women." Wonderful. Nothing says comfort like being diagnosed by a man who once called your spine melancholy. He arrives 10 minutes later carrying a medical bag, a monocle, and absolutely zero interest in what you're feeling. After a brief glance at your general existence, he declares it's womb unrest, or possibly moral inflammation. It's hard to tell. He's already prepping the syringe. "You'll feel better soon," he assures you, while loading enough morphine to knock out a medium-sized horse. "We just need to quiet the feminine system." You nod, not because you agree, but because your options are be sedated or be institutionalized. The needle goes in, the pain goes out. So does your memory of what you were complaining about. "Much improved," the doctor says smugly, already halfway out the door. You lie back, comfortably numb and just foggy enough to stop wondering why your uterus was ever considered a philosophical issue. Victorian medicine had a complicated relationship with women. Specifically, it didn't know what to do with them, didn't want to ask, and assumed most problems involved either the uterus or opinions. Menstrual cramps were rarely treated as a real physical condition. Instead, doctors described them as symptoms of female discontent, unrest, or excessive reflection. One physician in The Lancet, 1871, blamed menstruation for everything from hysteria to poor penmanship. The most common cure, morphine. A few drops in a glass of water could dull the pain, mute the complaints, and, most importantly, prevent women from talking about their feelings during polite dinner parties. Morphine was prescribed liberally for menstrual cramps, back pain, fainting spells, uterine agitation, mood swings, crying near curtains. Often, these were grouped together under the umbrella term female hysteria, a diagnosis so vague it could be applied to anyone who spoke too loudly, disagreed with their husband, or made direct eye contact with a chair. Morphine was frequently paired with laudanum or bromide, sold as patent medicines like Dr. Palmer's monthly tonic for regulating the feminine flow and discouraging of nonsense. Mother Pritchard's mood, stabilizing elixir contained morphine, opium and a feint, warning about drowsiness during important conversations. McGregor's womb drops, available at most railway stations and some hardware stores. Some doctors even administered injections directly into the lower back or abdomen, believing the morphine would soothe the uterus into obedience. One 1894 medical case described a woman much improved after 3 doses and a stern talking to. For wealthier women, morphine was simply part of the monthly routine, stored in elegant glass bottles on mirrored trays next to hairpins and smelling salts. They referred to it as their quiet hour, or my little helper, or simply Thursday. Of course, long-term addiction was a problem, but this was usually blamed on moral weakness, rather than the fact that patients had been drugged monthly for 30 years, and if a woman still complained, there was always the fallback solution: sedate, rest, and repeat. You're lying on a fainting couch, breathing heavily and trying not to feel anything. The doctor rolls in a strange brass device with a crank handle and asks the maid to leave the room. You're told to relax, and that everything you're about to experience is entirely clinical. The doctor has already given you a generous shot of morphine to calm the nerves, which is polite Victorian code for please stop screaming at the furniture. Now you're reclining on a fainting couch, pleasantly foggy, watching him crank up a brass contraption that looks like someone mated a sewing machine with a locomotive. Gears spin, belts flap, and the noise is somewhere between angry beehive and train arriving late. He assures you this is entirely medical. Moments later the device is applied. You gasp, partly from shock, partly from the morphine haze, and partly from, well, results. There's a definite sense of something happening, mingling relief with the kind of deep embarrassment usually reserved for forgetting hymn lyrics in church. The nurse draws the curtains tighter. The doctor clears his throat, mutters, all clinical, and increases the speed until the wallpaper vibrates in sympathy. You briefly wonder if the French invented this, which would explain why they always seem so smug at dinner parties. Within minutes you collapse into the cushions, flushed, dazed, and utterly cured. At least until next week's appointment. By the mid-19th century, female hysteria had become one of the most common diagnoses in Britain. The symptoms included menstrual cramps, headaches, insomnia, irritability, and, in some cases, simply existing too loudly. Doctors saw it everywhere. One wag in the Lancet even joked that hysteria was the single most enduring ailment of womanhood. Morphine quickly became the standard treatment. It dulled pain, softened nerves, and most importantly for Victorian men, made patients quiet. A few drops of laudanum or an injection directly to calm the feminine system could turn an overwrought patient into a model of passivity. But doctors soon complained that hysteria wasn't always cured by sedation alone. Enter the infamous hysteria massage, a hands-on treatment that medical journals of the time described with unnerving professionalism. It worked, but doctors grumbled that it was tedious and left their wrists sore. So, like any men of science, they invented machines to do the job. By the 1880s, steam-powered and electromechanical vibrators appeared in clinics, advertised as efficient, clinical, and entirely respectable. One advertisement promised restored cheerfulness in under 15 minutes. Patients left euphoric. Doctors recorded balanced nerves and congratulated themselves on their innovation. Morphine often accompanied these sessions, administered before to quiet resistance, or after to ensure patients left calm, dazed, and unlikely to complain. And by the 1890s, Heroin was marketed as a non-addictive alternative for nervous women, appearing in tonics and drops designed for hysteria, sleeplessness, and general discontent. The result? Women left clinics not only adjusted by brass machinery, but also chemically sedated. A double cure that kept patients coming back week after week until dependency set in. And yet, for decades, this was considered cutting-edge medicine. You leave the clinic with wobbly knees, a bottle of morphine drops for home use, and a doctor's note that simply reads, "Patient vastly improved." On the walk home, you pass a chemist's shop. Rows of syrup bottles gleam in the window, their cheerful labels promising relief for coughs, teething, and restless nights. You step closer and squint. The main ingredient? Heroin. And apparently, it's for children. You stumble into the chemist's shop, clutching your morphine habit like it's a guilty secret wrapped in lace. Your hands shake, your eyes twitch. You look exactly like the kind of customer who says, "Nothing serious, just something for the nerves," before collapsing onto the counter. The chemist greets you with the forced cheer of a man who has personally sold morphine to half the parish. You whisper, "I need something safer, something that won't turn me into this." He beams, reaches under the counter and places a bright little bottle in front of you. The label is bold, heroic, almost smug. Heroin. "Marvel of modern science," he declares. "All the relief, none of the dreadful dependence. Buyer themselves recommend it. You'll be virtuous before you've finished your supper." You squint. "Non-addictive?" "Absolutely," he says, with the confidence of a man who's never been wrong in his life, but often has. You take a cautious sip. It tastes faintly of cherries, victory, and bad decisions. Instantly your bones loosen, your eyelids drift, and you feel like you've just made peace with every curtain in the house. "Remarkable," you mumble, gripping the counter as though it's politely vibrating. "I feel so wholesome." "Precisely," the chemist beams, sliding 2 more bottles into your handbag. "Take as much as you like, for coughs, for sleep, for sorrow. Entirely safe." You leave the shop walking like a hymn in human form, convinced you have finally found salvation. And yet, by the time you reach your doorstep, you're already planning your second dose. By the 1890s, doctors had begun to notice an inconvenient truth. Their miracle cure, morphine, was turning respectable patients into lifelong dependents. Widows, spinsters, war veterans, and anyone with nerves were quietly hooked. What medicine needed was a fresh solution, a chemical saviour. Enter heroin. First synthesized in 1874, heroin sat on the shelf until Bayer began marketing it in the 1890s as the perfect non-addictive alternative to morphine. The company's advertisements promised relief from coughs, sorrow, and the shame of morphine dependence. All the benefits, none of the chains, one circular declared, as if chemistry had finally decided to be merciful. Doctors embraced it eagerly. The British Medical Journal praised heroin for its singular efficacy in treating tubercular coughs and restoring tranquility to the nervous. German physicians reported morphine addicts cured by switching to heroin, a cure that conveniently left them now addicted to heroin. Patients adored it. Heroin came in syrups, powders, and cheerful cough lozenges. It was mixed into tonics, infused into candies, and prescribed for everyone from anxious mothers to frail pensioners. Bayer even sold it as a children's cough suppressant in friendly yellow packaging. Nothing says wholesome like drugging your child with what we now classify as a Schedule I narcotic. But the honeymoon was short. By the early 1900s, letters began trickling into medical journals with ominous phrases, "Patient shows preference," "Dosage increased without direction," "Reluctant to discontinue use," translation. People loved heroin a little too much. Within a decade, Britain's medical officers were admitting what had been obvious from the start, that heroin was not the saintly twin of morphine, but its faster, smoother, and far more addictive sibling. The irony was exquisite. In trying to free patients from morphine, doctors had handed them something stronger, shinier, and aggressively advertised as safe. The cure had been worse than the disease, but with better branding. You sit at home with your bottle of non-addictive medicine, floating somewhere between holy revelation and sofa upholstery. The chemist's words echo in your head, entirely safe. But at midnight you find yourself staring at the bottle as though it's whispering your name. By morning you've already finished half of it, and the doctor is suggesting another prescription. Not for your cough, not for your sorrow, but for the habit you swore you didn't have. You're at a very respectable dinner party. The table is covered in silver, lace, and enough overcooked beef to start a famine. The conversation has reached its sixth retelling of why railways will save Britain, and you're quietly praying for death. Then salvation arrives. The hostess leans in with a conspiratorial smile. "A little cordial," she whispers, as though offering state secrets. You nod. Anything to dull the agony of hearing about railway timetables again. She pours from a crystal decanter into your glass. It looks like sherry. It tastes like cherries, velvet, and extremely poor decision-making. "Heroin tonic," she chirps. "Bayer's latest. Marvellous for the nerves." You nod politely, already halfway through your second glass. Suddenly the roast is delicious, the railways are thrilling, and the wallpaper seems to be flirting with you. Meanwhile, across town, a working girl takes laudanum for her cough and is condemned in tomorrow's newspaper as a moral failure. But here, surrounded by lace and candlelight, it's called having taste. In Victorian Britain, addiction wasn't just about chemistry, it was about class. Among the poor, laudanum was the drug of choice, cheap, bitter, and available at every corner chemist. Working women used it for period pain, factory men for sore backs, parents for restless children. It came in brown bottles with handwritten labels, smelled vaguely like despair, and made you look shabby. The newspapers had a field day. Laudanum drinkers were degenerate, fallen, and morally suspect. One temperance pamphlet warned that the poor were sinking into vice drop by drop. The implication was clear. Addiction in the lower classes was filth, weakness, and irresponsibility. Meanwhile, the wealthy were doing exactly the same thing, only with better packaging. Respectable ladies took morphine injections for their delicate nerves. Aristocrats sipped heroin syrups decanted into crystal bottles, flavoured with cherry and branded with names like soothing elixir for the cultured household. Doctors praised these patients for their refined constitutions and delicate sensibilities, which is Victorian code for money. The hypocrisy was glaring. A widow sedated on morphine drops was described in the Illustrated London News as quietly enduring her grief. A maid on laudanum for the exact same symptom was lost to the bottle. Even doctors played along. Reports of morphine dependency among the better sort were phrased as habitual tranquility, or a fondness for her tonic. But when the poor succumbed, it was vice, ruin, and a cautionary tale for the Sunday sermon. One satirist in Punch nailed it perfectly. A lady sipping morphia in her drawing room is considered genteel. Her laundress doing the same in the scullery is considered drunk. In other words, addiction was respectable if you had lace curtains. You sip your glass of heroin, cordial at the dinner table, confident that no one will judge you. After all, addiction looks positively elegant in cut crystal. The newspapers certainly won't call it vice, not when they're too busy printing full-page advertisements for the next miracle cure. Turn the page, and there it is. A grinning cherub, a glowing family, and bold letters promising that one syrup will fix everything from coughs to cholera to the general misery of life. The secret: morphine, chloroform, and a very cheerful typeface. Because in Victorian Britain, nothing sold faster than medicine by advertisement. This morning's newspaper is half war reports and half sales pitch for Dr. Collis Brown's chlorodyne. The advertisement beams with confidence, a household blessing. Recommended by physicians, praised by mothers, indispensable in every home. In the engraving, a smiling mother reclines serenely while her children play angelically at her feet. Children who, if they're actually dosed with chlorodyne, are probably just unconscious. The list of cures is exhaustive. Coughs, sleeplessness, cholera, neuralgia, female complaints, and, a personal favourite, the general misery of life. At last, a medicine that handles both typhoid fever and Monday mornings. Tiny whispers in medical journals occasionally mention dependency, but the ad assures readers it is perfectly safe if taken as directed. And who wouldn't trust a product made of morphine, chloroform and treacle, sold next to hair tonic and boot polish? Doctors, meanwhile, keep endorsing it enthusiastically. After all, anything that makes patients quiet is a medical miracle, side effects politely ignored. According to the advertisement, chlorodyne doesn't just soothe illness, it soothes society. Dr. J. Collis Brown's chlorodyne was one of the Victorian era's loudest success stories in medical marketing. A patent medicine so aggressively advertised, it seemed to cure everything but embarrassment. Originally concocted by Brown, a British Army officer in India, it was pitched as a universal remedy. Coughs, colds, insomnia, cholera, diarrhea, depression, neuralgia, female complaints, and, if you read between the lines, marital discontent. Advertisements promised that one spoonful could quiet a baby, calm a widow, settle a soldier, and restore peace to the entire empire. Its real ingredients, morphine, chloroform and treacle, essentially chemical hibernation in liquid form. The ads leaned heavily on respectability. Chlorodyne wasn't hawked as a seedy street drug, it was a household blessing. Doctors endorsed it, newspapers praised it, mothers swore by it. The message was clear. Respectable families had a bottle of chlorodyne right next to the Bible and the silver polish. The problem was dosage. A teaspoon soothed. 2 might silence you permanently. By the 1870s, case reports of overdoses and dependency were quietly stacking up. One Lancet editorial in 1874 noted it was habit-forming and should be used with care, a warning that patent medicine ads blithely ignored. Instead, the marketing grew sunnier. Testimonials boasted of miraculous recoveries. Slogans claimed it was safer than laudanum and the only true cure for cholera. The fact that patients sometimes died from cholera treatment was inconveniently not featured in the advertising copy. It worked. Chlorodyne became a Victorian bestseller, stocked in apothecaries across Britain and the colonies. Its packaging grew increasingly elaborate, embossed lettering, fancy bottles, endless slogans, because nothing says family-friendly quite like morphine laced with chloroform dressed up as modern progress. For decades it remained popular, even as reformers muttered about addiction, overdoses, and its use as a quiet poison in more than a few domestic scandals. The ads kept coming, the endorsements kept flowing, and Victorian households kept dosing themselves, reassured by the words printed in bold, "A blessing to all families." So the public believed the advertisements, ignored the warnings, and trusted the doctors. Because in Victorian Britain, if a bottle said it was safe, then it was a cure. And if the cure didn't work, well, there was always more morphine in the cupboard. Last night you attended what was supposed to be a quiet supper. By midnight you were fencing a coat rack with a bread knife, serenading a tureen of soup, and blacking out somewhere between the port and the piano legs. This morning, you wake up strapped to a bed. The wallpaper is new, the air smells of disinfectant and despair, and a nurse is glaring at you as if she personally funded your liver. Rehabilitation, the doctor announces with grim satisfaction, holding up a syringe that looks like it belongs in an agricultural fair. You blink. Rehabilitation, you repeat. That sounds restful. Not restful, he corrects, corrective. The injection goes in, your stomach stages an immediate revolution. A bucket is shoved under your chin with the encouraging label "Therapeutic Use Only." The doctor beams as you retch. Splendid. Soon your body will associate alcohol with sickness. Much like a dog hearing a bell and expecting supper, you will see a glass of sherry and expect, well, this. You vomit again. Somewhere down the corridor another patient cries, No more port before collapsing into a brass spittoon. The nurses cheer like it's Derby Day. That's when it hits you. This is the cure. They're training you like a dog, only instead of bells and biscuits, it's gin and buckets. And you realise with dread, the next time someone opens champagne at a party, you might be the one hunched over the punch bowl. Congratulations, you're officially in danger of becoming the Victorian party pooper. By the late 19th century, alcoholism was becoming a social crisis. Britain's drinking culture collided with industrial life, and reformers sought ways to cure the habit. Into this gap stepped apomorphine, a derivative of morphine discovered in the 1860s. Unlike morphine, apomorphine did not soothe or sedate. It was a violent emetic. Doctors noticed that when alcoholics were dosed with apomorphine and then given alcohol, they vomited profusely and began to associate liquor with sickness. Thus was born one of history's strangest addiction therapies, aversion treatment by projectile purging. In Britain, clinics experimented with the method in the 1870s to 1890s. Patients were restrained, injected, and made to vomit repeatedly after drinking spirits. Doctors wrote with solemn pride about their results. One case in the British Medical Journal, 1899, reported, after 12 days the patient would not tolerate even the smell of whiskey without physical revolt. The treatment was often paired with morphine, given before or after sessions to calm patients, help them sleep, or reduce withdrawal symptoms. In effect, doctors were using morphine to make patients tolerate the cure derived from morphine. There was even a famous gold cure from Dr. Leslie Keeley, whose proprietary formula was whispered to contain apomorphine. Clinics advertised miraculous recoveries, though relapse rates were quietly high. For patients, the experience was unforgettable, not because it worked long-term, but because it was traumatic. One reformer admitted that many cured men simply resumed drinking after a few weeks, vomiting as they went. Still, for a society desperate for solutions, it was hailed as progress. Science had finally weaponized nausea in the name of temperance. You stagger out of the clinic pale, weak, and carrying the proud title of improved. The doctor waves cheerfully. Avoid the gin shops. You nod, then immediately collapse into a cab. The driver suggests you take the waters at a seaside spa. Fresh air, gentle walks, and of course, a discreet supply of morphine to keep the nerves steady. Because nothing says recovery quite like a holiday for your habit. You're lying face down on a hard massage table at the spa, wrapped in more towels than a Turkish bazaar. The doctor has already given you a generous dose of morphine to assist with relaxation, which is Victorian code for you won't remember this nonsense. The masseur begins what he calls a therapeutic massage. What it feels like is someone kneading dough with unresolved anger issues. He presses so hard on your back you briefly wonder if he's trying to fold you in half like a travel map. Normally you'd scream, but thanks to the morphine you simply giggle and ask if he's making bread. Excellent response, the doctor says from the corner, jotting notes. Patient calm, pliable, and oddly cheerful. They call it therapy. You call it being beaten with enthusiasm while too drugged to mind. And when it's finished, they tuck you back into a wicker chair, hand you another morphine tonic, and proudly declare you restored by the waters. By the late 19th century, Britain was overrun with health resorts, cure houses, and spa towns. If you had money, nerves, or simply too much free time, you could collapse dramatically in London and be whisked off to Bath, Malvern, or some windswept seaside sanatorium where doctors promised to restore your vitality. The treatments were billed as science, but in reality they sounded like punishment disguised as leisure. Hydrotherapy meant being dunked in cold baths, wrapped in wet sheets, or blasted with hoses until you either felt invigorated or applied for sainthood. Rest cures involved lying perfectly still in bed for weeks on end, forbidden from reading, writing, or having opinions. Dietary cures recommended bland mush, beef tea, and the occasional orange slice, all served with the excitement of a tax form. Fresh air regimens required patients to sit for hours on porches or cliff sides in wicker. chairs wrapped in blankets, staring into the fog and trying not to die of boredom. And yet, somehow, these resorts were wildly popular. Why? Because the real cure wasn't the cold baths or the beef tea. The real cure was morphine. Doctors dosed patients liberally to help them sleep through their treatments. Nervous women received drops to calm the system. Businessmen were given injections before being shoved into freezing tubs. Morphine made everything seem tolerable. The long walks, the endless silence, the fact that you were paying a small fortune to sit in a wicker chair and hallucinate that the sea air was healing your spleen. Patients wrote glowing letters home. One society lady gushed that her time at Malvern left her restored in body and spirit, though her diary revealed she spent most of it pleasantly detached in a haze of tonic. Another gentleman proudly declared that the seaside air had cured his melancholia, though the nurse later admitted he had been unconscious for most of the week. The spa owners encouraged this illusion. Pamphlets promised miraculous recoveries, complete with sketches of cheerful patients striding along promenades. In reality, the promenades were filled with pale ghosts shuffling aimlessly in blankets, occasionally revived by a discreet morphine dropper when enthusiasm flagged. Even the most eccentric cures, sandbaths, mud wrappings and steam closets that made you look like a lobster about to be served, were tolerated, because morphine dulled the indignity. To the Victorians, spas were a respectable way to collapse. You weren't an addict or a patient, you were simply taking the waters, and if the waters didn't help, the morphine certainly did. You stagger out of the rehabilitation clinic pale, shaking, and clutching a certificate that proudly declares you improved. The nurse assures you the vomiting will pass. The doctor tells you to avoid gin shops. On the way home, you spot a catalogue lying on the seat of your cab. The cover beams with ornate lettering. Miracle remedies delivered to your door. No more clinics, no more buckets, no more screaming into spittoons. Just flip a page, point at a bottle, and have salvation arrive by post. Because in Victorian Britain, why suffer in person when you can order your addiction like socks? The postman arrives, whistling cheerfully, and hands you a small brown parcel. No lecture, no raised eyebrows, no tedious wait for a doctor's house call. Just a tidy box tied up with string and your name on it. You open it like it's Christmas morning. Inside, a gleaming bottle labelled Doctor, Peabody's Universal Restorative for all that ails you. Morphine, by mail. No sitting in the parlour while the doctor mutters about your nervous constitution. No awkward explanations about why you fainted in 3 different tea shops this week. No more pretending to have cholera just to get a refill. Now, salvation arrives with the morning post, right alongside your bills and your aunt's dreadful letters. Who needs medical advice when you can order narcotics like stationery? Congratulations. You've subscribed to Victorian wellness delivered directly to your doorstep. By the late 19th century, Britain had discovered the greatest medical breakthrough of all. You no longer needed to talk to a doctor to get your morphine. Enter the mail order catalogue. Glossy booklets and pamphlets flooded households, each one packed with ornate lettering, engraved illustrations, and promises grander than the Bible. They offered remedies for every imaginable ailment. Melancholy, sleeplessness, female complaints, coughs, gout, spiritual unease, and, a personal favourite, the general decline of life. And at the heart of many of these miracle cures, morphine and heroin. All a customer had to do was fill out an order slip, send coins or a postal note, and wait for the postman. A week later, the front door would swing open to reveal salvation in a box. Bottles of narcotic-laced tonics nestled alongside the morning paper, and letters from relatives. Advertisements presented these cures as both wholesome and modern. Dr. Peabody's Universal Restorative claimed to cure sorrow, spasms, and the agitations of the heart. Fellow's hyperphosphate syrup was sold as a gentle pick-me-up for intellectuals, though it contained enough morphine to make algebra tolerable. The testimonials were masterpieces of creative writing. After 1 bottle, I am cured of my cough, restored to good humour, and enjoy a more cheerful marriage. This remedy not only removed my insomnia, but also made my piano playing more agreeable. My baby no longer cries, and neither do I. We both sleep beautifully. Doctors occasionally grumbled. One editorial in The Lancet sniffed that the increasing trade in patent narcotic cures delivered by post-Foster's dependency and undermines the dignity of medicine. Translation: patients had figured out how to skip the doctor's bill, and the public adored it. No consultations, no shame, no moral lectures, just a few coins, a postage stamp, and a reliable courier. Addicts could reorder endlessly, disguising their dependency as shopping. It was Amazon Prime for morphine. This convenience made addiction not only widespread, but invisible. To neighbours, a household receiving parcels of restoratives looked perfectly respectable. After all, the labels were embossed with gold lettering, endorsed by doctors, and printed in the same catalogues that sold sewing kits and hair tonic. By dressing narcotics as consumer goods and shipping them like household necessities, Victorian society managed to normalise them. Morphine wasn't a vice, it was a product, and in many homes it was the most frequently reordered product of all. You tuck the empty bottle of universal restorative into the waste bin and glance at the order form for another. No doctor visits, no questions, no delays. Just steady supplies of serenity delivered by post. The catalogue insists it's safe. The doctor never asked. The postman doesn't care. And when everyone's addicted, medicine will act shocked, because nothing is more Victorian than being utterly complicit, and then pretending to be surprised. You're sitting by the fire, prescription bottles scattered across the table like party favours. Each one is empty, each one once promised to restore your nerves, calm your cough, or cure your grief. Now they're just glass reminders that the cure became the habit. The doctor knocks, steps in and looks horrified. Not horrified that you're addicted, horrified that everyone is. The servants, the neighbours, the children, even the vicar down the road. The entire street is floating somewhere between serene and unconscious. "Good heavens," he exclaims. "We must investigate this alarming epidemic of morphine and heroin addiction." You stare at him. He prescribed it. He endorsed it. He sold it in cheery bottles with gold lettering. But now he's shocked. Positively shocked. Victorian medicine has discovered its final glorious irony. It created the addiction and then had the audacity to clutch its pearls about the epidemic. By the dawn of the 20th century, the consequences of Victorian medicine's love affair with morphine and heroin were undeniable. Dependence was widespread across classes and genders. Grieving widows, fashionable ladies, overworked businessmen, shell-shocked veterans and restless children all bore the mark of habitual use. Medical journals that once praised these drugs as safe now printed grim warnings. One physician admitted in the British Medical Journal that morphinism is a scourge among the better sort. Others noted heroin's tendency to enslave patients faster than morphine itself. Public health officials wrung their hands. Newspapers sounded alarms. But the outrage rang hollow. For decades, doctors had prescribed morphine and heroin as liberally as cough drops, while advertisements declared them household blessings. Only when the damage was visible everywhere did medicine step back in mock astonishment. The hypocrisy was striking. Addiction among the poor had long been condemned as vice. Addiction among the wealthy was now reframed as tragedy. The same bottles that had been celebrated as miracles were rebranded as dangers, and thus the cycle repeated. First a wonder drug, then a habit, finally a scandal. The final irony: morphine and heroin didn't just survive Victorian medicine, they thrived because of it. What began as cures became commodities sold in tonics, syrups, powders and lozenges, woven into the fabric of daily life until the distinction between patient and addict blurred into a single glass bottle on the mantel. Victorian medicine had set out to soothe, cure and modernise. Instead, it produced a society quietly addicted to its own prescriptions. And now, as the last tonic bottle is corked, and the sitting room sighs beneath gaslight, and the faint rustle of laudanum wrappers. I hope this peculiar stroll through Victorian addiction lingers, like the whisper of a remedy that promises everything and explains nothing. You've braved syringes, soothing syrups, cordial cocktails, and enough patent medicine to tranquilize a governess. But now it's time to rest. The prescriptions run dry, the hysteria's on pause, and for tonight, the household is finally quiet. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've made it through another evening inside history's most elegantly sedated disaster. Hit subscribe so we can unwrap another strange chapter of the past tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will carry you deeper, far from cheerful poisons and well-dressed denial, and into sleep.